Before we start this video, a large thank you to Zach, William, Locanus, and Lurking for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoy the video. Hello everybody, and today we're going to assign damage to our weapon using a damage collider, and then we're going to make it so we can switch weapons in both our left and right hands. So, I'm first going to begin by going into our prefabs. I'm going to go and grab the prefab here of our sword and open it up. And what we want to do is visualize where we're going to place the damage collider. So, what you want to do is, I'm going to use a box collider, so use any collider that you feel fits your weapon. The box collider is just going to fit nicely on the blade here, so we'll go with that. And you want to position it just wherever you want the hitbox to be on your weapon. I'm going to put mine on the blade, obviously, and I'm just going to position this how I like it and kind of set the height here in the transform, make it just around the same size as the blade. Doesn't need to be exactly perfect. So I'm just going to copy this collider here now. And by the way, if you want a better view for setting up damage colliders, I actually prefer the isometric view. You can just click this little icon here in the top right of the scene view to switch it. And finally, I'm just going to tick is trigger on this collider. After you have all of your dimensions set up, what we're going to do is basically create a new empty game object under the weapon model. I'm going to make a new one because I want the damage collider to have its own object. And I'm just going to call this damage collider. And then we can copy the component of the box collider we just made and paste it here, and make sure you set the layer of this new game object to damage collider. So it will actually look for the player character's layer. Now, I'm just going to paste this component as new, and then I'm going to remove it from the weapon models object, and we're good to go. So let's add another component here in the form of a new script. I'm going to call this melee weapon damage collider. Let's create and add that, and it's going to derive from our regular damage collider, but it's going to have a couple other things going for it as the series progresses. So I'm going to start by erasing the start and update functionality, put in my namespace as is per tradition, and I'm going to make this derive from damage collider. So the main thing that's different right away is we're going to have an attacking character at all times holding this weapon, obviously, so there's always a reference to the character that's using it. Why do we have this here? Well, let's say you want to calculate damage. You can use this to calculate this character's weapon damage modifiers when you're taking damage, and you can change stuff like that in the take damage effect. But don't worry about that for now. We're just going to put it here because it will be important in the very near future. So let's go to the damage collider now, and let's make two virtual functions here, virtual voids. I'm going to call this enable and disable damage collider. And what this is going to do is basically toggle the collider itself on and off so it can be used to hit something, because your collider is not going to be on all the time, only when you're swinging the weapon or when the attack is going off. And now, on top of that too, when we turn it off, we want to reset the characters that have been damaged so we can damage them again. Otherwise, when it opens up again, you won't be able to hit this character a second time because they're already on the list. So let's just make a header here, call this collider, and let's make a protected. And I'm just going to put a collider variable here. And this is a reference to the actual collider itself that the damage collider uses for on-trigger enter, the one we just made, the box collider, or it could be a sphere collider, whatever collider you're going to use. This is a reference to that itself. So we can use that then. I'm just going to call it damage collider. We can use that down here and just say damage collider.enabled is equal to true. This is on enable damage collider. And then on disable damage collider, we can say damage collider.enabled is equal to false. And then we reset our list by saying characters damaged.clear. Again, this is so we can damage the same character again on the next attack. So you're going to turn on the damage collider for a set amount of frames during the attack animation, and then turn it off when the attack period where you can damage is over. This is for melee weapons, obviously. So when we do that, we're going to clear this list so you can damage any characters again on your next attack. Okay, so that looks good. Let's save that. I'm just going to minimize this here now. Let's jump back into our project. I'm going to search up the player equipment manager. What we're going to do next is actually assign damage to our weapon. So how do we do that? Well, when we load a right weapon, we want to assign the weapon's damage from the item itself. So we need to put that on its damage collider, because as it starts now, the damage collider will have 0 on everything. And we need to do that for a left weapon too. So let's make a way to do that. I'm going to create a script on the main game object of the weapon. I'm going to call it weapon manager. And in the future, this is going to handle things like buffing your weapon, like the time remaining on buffs, and just anything really that will change your weapon in any capacity. So let's open it up, erase the start and update function as is per tradition, drop in our namespace, and what I'm going to do now is create some functionality to reference our damage collider. So we're always going to have a melee weapon damage collider on our weapons because you can always kind of punch something with it, even if it's like a charm or, a bow if you want to, it can have a melee weapon damage collider. So I'm going to make a melee weapon damage collider variable, and if you want to see it in the inspector, you can use serialize field. And then in awake, I'm going to say melee weapon damage collider equals get component in children because it rests on the game object of a child in the hierarchy onto this game object. Now you can drag it in the inspector if you want, but you'd have to do that for every single weapon, so I'm just going to call mine on awake, but you do it as you see fit. So once we have that now, we can actually assign damage to the damage collider, so let's make a function to do that. Let's call this public void set weapon damage, and let's make this require a weapon item. So we can call this then from our equipment manager, you'll see in a moment. So let's make this require a weapon item, then we just simply say melee damage collider dot physical damage is equal to weapon dot physical damage. And we say melee damage collider dot magic damage is equal to weapon dot magic damage. You can see where this is going. And in the future, we can make a function too to calculate the scaling damage based on your stats, and we'll get into all that cool stuff, but right now we're going to keep it basic until we have this nice little game loop of getting in and attacking monsters and dying and stuff. So let's just assign all of our damages, and that's enough for now. And now we can go back into the player equipment manager, and let's make 2 new variables. We're going to make one for the left and right-handed weapon managers. And every time you change your weapons, these weapon managers obviously will change with your new weapon. So let's make one for right weapon manager and one for left weapon manager. And now, as you know, we're instantiating our weapon model right here. So we can actually grab the weapon manager from that model because it rests on the game object. So we can say right weapon manager is equal to, and then we're going to say the right hand weapon model dot get component weapon manager. And then all we do is do it down here for the left one as well. So we'll say left weapon manager is equal to the left hand weapon model dot get component weapon manager. And then what's next? Well, we simply say weapon manager, and then we set the damage. And since we know this is our right hand, we just pass the current right hand weapon from our inventory, and that's it. It's just that simple. Okay, I'm just going to do the same thing here for the left hand, so I'm just going to copy right weapon manager and paste this down here under the load left weapon. I'm going to change right to left, and I'm going to make sure I reference the left weapon in my inventory and not the right weapon. Okay, that looks good. Now, let's save that, and we can test this now in the project, so let's just save the prefab. I'm going to go to play mode now, and I start the game. If I click on my straight sword, you can see that I have a damage collider, and my damage value is 118, which is the number I set a while ago when we made the weapon item. So let's use this too to pass the character under the character causing damage. So we can just say melee damage collider dot character causing damage is equal to, and let's make this require a character manager. And we can call this character wielding weapon or character, whatever makes the most sense to you. I'm going to call mine character wielding weapon. And then all we just say is character causing damage is equal to the character wielding the weapon. And now it's going to give us an error because now we can't just pass a weapon item, we need to also pass a character manager. And we simply just pass our player because our player inherits from a character manager because they themselves are a character manager. And now if we save this and jump into the game, it should show us our character that wields the weapon. So I'm going to click on this weapon here, go down to the damage collider, and yes, it does. There we go. It's our player. That's working as intended. Cool. So what if you want to switch your weapons? Well, I'm going to duplicate this straight sword, and I'm going to call it broadsword. So I'm just going to use another one of my straight sword models here and just quickly set up another weapon. So just call it whatever you want. Just make sure you can tell that it's different so you can know this is working. I'm going to give it the name broadsword, and I'm going to drag in a new icon here and use one of these models. So I've just set this up here off video. It's the identical setup to the straight sword, just a different model. I'm going to come back into the player equipment manager here, and I'm going to just make some comments so we can separate right from left-handed actions so it's easier to see at first glance. Sticks out nice. I'm going to make a public void switch right weapon. So anything I'm about to write here, you can do the same thing for switch left weapon, just change the words right to left. We're going to focus on switch right weapon. I'll do switch left weapon off camera because we're going to take this slow and go through all the code. So I'm just going to copy and paste this and just say switch left weapon. I will remind you to go back and fill it in if you haven't at the end. So I'm going to go into the project here, delete this prefab from the scene that I just made, and I'm going to go over to the player inventory manager. And we're going to make some new variables. So what do we need for our switching weapons? Well, we need to have a list of weapons we could switch from. And I'm going to use 3 in each hand because that's what Elden Ring does. So I'm going to call this header quick slots. In the future it'll be your spells and your quick items here. But for now we're going to have an array of weapon items for left and right hand weapon items. So I'm just going to say weapons in right hand slots is equal to new. And I'm going to initialize this array at 3, as in 3 weapon slots. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the weapons in left-hand slots, equals a new array of weapon items with a size of 3. So that will give us 3 weapon slots to switch from. Now, let's start writing some logic. We're going to have to jump around a few times while writing this function because it's going to require other systems to work. I'll show you what I mean momentarily, but let's take it step by step. So we're going to say if the player is the owner first, you should only be running this if you're the owner, and if you're not the owner, let's return. So right below that, we can say player.playerAnimatorManager.playTargetActionAnimation. You can place some kind of equipping animation here now if you want to indicate that you are switching your weapon. So I'm just going to call mine swap_right_weapon01. We are not interacting, so we don't want to lock our player into an action. And we want to allow movement and rotation as well. So after that, I made a few notes here. So Elden Ring's weapon swap, and basically it checks if we have another weapon besides our main weapon. If we do, we don't swap to the unarmed. We just go back and forth between these two weapons. So for example, if I have a weapon in slot 1 and 3, I'll skip 2 if it's unarmed. I'll never go there. I'll only go from 1 to 3 or 3 to 1. But if we have one main weapon, we do swap to the unarmed weapon slot. And if we have 2 empty unarmed slots, we always skip 1. So basically, if you have 1 weapon equipped and you switch weapons, you'll go to unarmed, and then you'll go back to that 1 weapon. If you have 1 weapon equipped and then another weapon equipped on the 3rd slot, you'll skip unarmed entirely, and you'll never ever go to it. This is just how Elden Ring and Dark Souls 3 handles it, so we're going to recreate that exactly as it is. So I'm going to say weapon item, and I'm going to say selected weapon is equal to null, so making a variable here. So a variable of type weapon item is called selected weapon. This is going to be a weapon we switch to, and right now it's null. In the future, we want to come back here and disable two-handing if we are two-handing, because when you switch your weapons, you want to make sure you're un-two-handing whatever thing you have equipped right now. Next, we're going to check our weapon index. We have 3 slots, so we need to make an index. What's an index? Well, it just tells us which weapon in the array we have currently equipped. So public int right-hand weapon index is equal to 0. Public int left-hand weapon index is equal to 0. Let's say you have the second weapon equipped in your right hand slot. It will be index 1 because it goes 0, 1, 2. 0 is weapon 1, 1 is weapon 2, and 2 is weapon 3. So next we're going to say player.playerInventoryManager.right-hand weapon index plus equals 1. So we're just adding 1. That's the first thing we do when we switch our weapon after playing the animation. We up the index. So we're going to try to go to the next slot in our index basically. Then we're going to say if player.playerInventoryManager.right-hand weapon index is less than 0 or player.playerInventoryManager.right-hand weapon index is greater than 2, we want to initially bring it back to 0 because we've gone too far. We're out of bounds. So we'll say player.playerInventoryManager.right-hand weapon index is equal to 0. So I'm going to say if our index is out of bounds, we just bring it back to the start or reset it. This is to make sure we don't get an error for index array out of bounds. Okay, so next, we have a way to increment our index, and we have a way to reset it if it's out of bounds. So I'm just going to make a comment here, add 1 to our index to try to get to the next weapon. Now, let's actually look in our inventory for the next weapon, and we have to be able to discern if our weapon next in line is unarmed or not. So let's make a for each loop. For each weapon item, inside our player inventory, I'm going to call this weapon, inside our player inventory.right-hand weapons, we want to do something. So let's say player.playerInventory.weapons in right-hand slots. What do we want to do here? Well, we have to compare every weapon and check if they're the unarmed weapon. So let's just see if this weapon is not the unarmed weapon. And we don't have an unarmed weapon yet, so what we're going to do is make that. Let's save the game, go back into our project, go to Data, Items, Weapons, Melee Weapons, right-click, Create, and then we're going to go to Items, Weapons, Melee Weapon. I'm just going to call this Unarmed. And this is going to be the default weapon you have if nothing is equipped. So you can give it a damage value if you want. I'll give mine a base stamina cost of 5 and a damage value of 8. And you don't need to name this or give it an icon. This will be the exception because it's not really an item. It's the absence of an item. So the ID is important here. This is how we're going to tell. You can see all 3 of these have item IDs, but we want to make it so we don't have to set all these manually, because if you accidentally give the same or 2 items the same ID, then you have a problem. So let's right click and make an empty game object, call this world item database. And let's make a script on this called world item database. Let's create and add it. This is going to basically automatically generate IDs for every item in the game, and it's going to give us a way to fetch items using their ID, which is very, very necessary for multiplayer. So let's erase start and update functionality, drop in our namespace, and let's make a public static world item database instance. So we're making this a singleton. There's only one in the scene at any given time, but there is always one present. We're going to say if instance is equal to null, then instance is equal to this. If instance is not null, something is wrong, and destroy this game object because there is already a world item database present. So what do we want to do? Well, we're going to make a couple variables here first in the form of lists. So the first one is going to be a serializable field for a list of all of the weapons we have in our game. Every single time we make one, we add it to this list. And we're going to say this is equal to a new list weapon item. Next, we need a list for every single item in the game. Basically, your list of weapons, your list of head equipment, body equipment, they all get added to this final list. That is the totality of every item in the game. Why do we do this? Well, this is how we're going to generate unique IDs for them all. I'll show you. So this is a list of every item we have in the game that you want to have an ID. Now, after awake, after you've checked for the singleton, we're going to say for each weapon that we have in our list of weapons, we want to add all of those weapons to the list of total items we have in the game. Why are we giving each item type its own unique list too? You'll see momentarily. So for each weapon, let's add that weapon to the item list. And then we're going to use a for loop. And then for every single item we have in the items list, we're going to say items I dot item ID is equal to I. And this will iterate through the list and assign every item a numerical ID in the form of I, so in the form of its position in the list. So assign all of our items a unique item ID. And then we're going to say add all of our weapons to our list of items. Cool, so that's a cool way to grab items, and now we have a list of everything. So what do we do next? Well, I'm going to erase this serializable field for the list of total items, make this private because I don't need to see that. You can keep it serialized if you want. And then I'm going to jump back over into the project and add our unarmed, our straight sword, and our broadsword. So this gives us 3 different weapon items to sift through. Next, I'm going to go to the straight sword here. You can see the item ID is 0. When I start the game, watch it change. It is now 1. The broadsword should be 2. Yes, it is. And the unarmed should be 0 because that is their order in their items list. Now, I stop the game. You can see their IDs have still been kept the same. So that's cool. Now, let's make a serializable field weapon item variable for specifically our unarmed item, because we're going to be referencing this with weapon checks. This is a special item. It's the case for an absence of an item. So we need to keep it its own variable here for this just to quickly reference it. You can do this other ways, but I find having a direct reference is the best way. Like, for example, if you know its ID, you can just reference its ID, but then if its ID ever changes, you're in trouble. So I'm going to keep this public because we're going to reference it, and I'm going to keep it its own variable. Now, down here in our for each loop, we can simply check to see if the weapon in our right hand is equal to the unarmed weapon by comparing their IDs. So I say if player.player inventory manager dot weapons in right slots, and then I'm going to pass the current index player.player inventory manager dot right hand weapon index dot item ID does not equal world item database dot instance dot unarmed weapon ID, then we know we're good. So what do we do next? Let's make a comment here so this is clear first. If this weapon does not equal the unarmed weapon, then we proceed. So we're checking to see if this has the same ID number as the unarmed weapon, because that would mean it is the same. It might not necessarily be the same scriptable because it could be an instantiated clone, but if it shares the same ID, it is still the same weapon. We say selected weapon is equal to player.player inventory manager dot weapons in right hand slots, and we say player.player inventory manager right hand weapon index. Now we make another comment here. Assign the network weapon ID so that it switches for all connected clients. So we need to know, using an ID, a network variable, which weapon we have equipped. So we do that by using its ID. And then when we switch that number, we're going to change the weapon. So let's do that next. So we go to the player network manager, and we make a new network variable, 2 of them actually, one for the left hand and one for the right hand weapon IDs. And these will be the current weapons you're holding, but specifically their IDs. And then using their IDs, we're going to grab the actual weapon and equip it. And then we're going to use an onValueChanged call like before to make this happen automatically. So let's say public network variable of type int. I'm going to call this current right hand weapon ID, equal it to a new network variable of type int. And I'm going to set it to 0 by default. I'm going to set it to the read permission is everybody. and the right permission is owner. Pretty standard stuff. We can copy that in its entirety now and paste it and change right to left. And then we have two network variables for our right and left-handed weapons. So the idea is we change these numbers, and then when these numbers change, they trigger an onChange event, and then that changes our weapon. That is what we're going to do. So let's make a public void for onRight weapon changed, or rather onCurrent right-hand weapon ID changed. And then we make two variables here, int for the old ID, and then an int for the new ID. And then we can do the same thing for our left hand. So let's copy and paste that and change onCurrent left hand weapon ID. So this is going to be pretty straightforward. All we do is make a variable for weapon item. We'll say new weapon is equal to world item database.instance, and what we want to do is get a weapon by its ID. How do we do that? Well, what we can do is actually create a function to get an item from this list by its ID. So let's make a public weapon item get weapon by ID, and then we just need to pass an integer for the ID. So let's go up here and say using system.link. I actually don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but that's how you spell it, LINQ. And then we're going to say int ID. Now all we do is say return weapons. This is why we made separate lists, by the way, earlier. First or default. And then we want to pass weapon, and then we're going to say equals greater than weapon.weapon ID is equal to ID. So what this is going to do basically is going to check this entire list. It's going to look for an ID that matches the ID you passed and then pass you back that weapon item. That's it. So now we can reference this function and actually get this weapon using its ID. So let's go over now to the player network manager, and we're going to say weapon item, new weapon is equal to world item database.instance get weapon by ID and pass the new ID. Now that we have the weapon, we're going to equip that weapon. So then we're going to say player.playerInventoryManager.current right-hand weapon is equal to new weapon. And then we say player.playerEquipmentManager load right-handed weapon. Now I have to make a reference to our player equipment manager on our player manager script because I don't have that yet. So I'm going to use the keyword hide in inspector so we don't have to see it. I'm going to make it public so it can be accessed from other scripts, which is what we're trying to do now. And I'm going to call it player equipment manager. And I'm going to say player equipment manager on awake is equal to get component player equipment manager because again sits in the same game object. So we're going to say player.playerEquipmentManager.load right weapon, and we're good to go. Now this should work. Let's do the same thing for the left-handed weapon. And now we need to make sure we're actually triggering these functions when that number changes. And I'm sure a lot of you know how to do that by now, so if you do, go ahead and do it. And if not, we're going to do it momentarily. So I'm going to go back over to the player equipment manager, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change our network variable. We're going to say player.playerNetworkManager.current right-hand weapon ID.value is equal to the player.playerInventoryManager. And then you pass your current weapon index, or optionally you can say selected weapon dot weapon ID. Both of it is the same, really. For reasons in the future, when we get into buffs, I'll show you why one could be slightly more easy to understand than the other, but for now, I'm just going to pass the current right weapon index dot item ID. You can use either. So let's save that. And now let's actually go and use our new functions to change the weapon when we switch the ID. So for that, let's go to onNetworkSpawn. Make sure it's outside of isOwner because you want the weapons to switch for everybody when the ID has been changed. PlayerNetworkManager.current right-hand weapon ID.onValueChanged plus equals PlayerNetworkManager.onRight weapon ID change. Do the same thing for the left, and now when this number changes, it should trigger this function to switch to the new weapon. So we're not done yet. We still have some logic to write inside the equipment manager, but I'm just going to make a few comments here to separate this again so it's easier to see in the future and at first glance. I'm going to save that, and now let's go back to the player equipment manager on our switch right-hand weapon function. I'm going to say if selected weapon is equal to null, and the player.playerInventoryManager.right-hand weapon index is less than 2, because that's our max, I'm going to say let's try to switch our weapon again to see if we get something else that's not the unarmed weapon. So this is the same function, we're just calling itself one more time. And eventually it's going to get above 2. And when that happens, we're going to say else, okay, we're above 2. So we've reached the cap here. What are we going to do? Well, we got to check to see if we are holding more than one weapon. Because remember, before I told you in Elden Ring, if you have more than one weapon, you never go to the unarmed weapon. You switch back and forth between weapon 1 and weapon 2. Even if it's on slots 1, 3, or 1 and 2, or 2 and 3, you just go back and forth between these 2 weapons. If you do only have one weapon, you'll go from the main weapon to your unarmed, the main weapon to your unarmed. So let's make a variable for weapon count, one for the first weapon, and then another variable for first weapon position in the array, or in the index rather. And I'll make a for loop for every weapon, player.player inventory manager.weapons right hand slots.length, if player.player inventory manager.weapons in right hand slots i.item ID does not equal world item database.instance.unarmed weapon.item ID, then we can assign some logic. We can say weapon count plus equals 1. We have more than one unarmed weapon, so our weapon count is now what it is plus 1. And then we can say if our first weapon is null, then we know this is the first weapon in our array. So we can say first weapon is equal to player.player inventory manager.weapons in right hand slots I, and that's it. When I say first weapon, I mean first weapon that's not unarmed, by the way. So then we're going to say first weapon position is equal to I, as in its position in the index. And then right below that, we can say if the weapon count is less than or equal to 1, well, we know we only have one weapon, so then we can switch to the unarmed weapon. So we can say player.inventory manager.current right hand weapon index is equal to -1. And then we can say selected weapon is equal to instantiate world item database.instance.unarmed weapon. Oops, this is supposed to be the right hand index, not current right hand weapon. There we go. Now we need to assign that by saying player.player network manager.current right hand weapon .value is equal to selected weapon .value, or you can use the unarmed weapon from the world item database. So this is looking good, and it should work, but we still have a couple more things to do. Else, if your weapon count is greater than 1, what you want to do is instead switch back to the other weapon you're holding and not the unarmed weapon, because you want to skip that entirely. So we do that by saying player.player inventory manager.right hand weapon index is equal to our first weapon position. And then we go back to our first weapon. We say player.player network manager.current right hand weapon id.value equals first weapon.item ID. So we jump back to the first weapon in our array. Now, I actually messed up. We should be instantiating this here, sorry. So on current right and left weapon change, make sure you're instantiating a clone of the weapon. Never use the direct weapon. It'll make more sense why down the road when we start adding buffs. And then back over on the player equipment manager, you don't need to actually instantiate a clone because you're just referencing its ID. The actual instantiation of the weapon happens right there. So over here on the player manager, I'm going to make another debug menu for switching our weapons, because we're not going to be able to switch it with a UI until we start UI, and we're not going to get to that for a little bit. So serializable field bool switch right weapon is equal to false. And then down here under update, we have a debug menu, or sorry, our debug function. I'm going to say if switch right hand weapon is equal to false. And then I'm just going to call our player equipment manager dot switch right hand weapon. This is just a quick way to test it out until we actually get our UI implemented nice and clean. So I'm going to save that now, and we should be able to jump into the scene and test it out. Before we do that, let's go to our player and make sure you assign on the prefab the current right and left hand weapon to unarmed by default, and every weapon in your weapon slots right and left hands to unarmed by default also. Otherwise, you will get an error. You can just make it so if there is a null, you can assign it to unarmed, but I just like setting it with a prefab. Much easier, you only got to do it one time. Next, let's go to the unarmed weapon, and let's make an empty game object for its weapon model. So let's just take our existing straight sword model, drag it into the scene, and all we got to do is just, where you see the weapon model here, just go down to that, and then remove the mesh renderer and the model here. And instead of having a box collider, let's use a sphere collider. Let's unpack this prefab and change the name to Weapon Unarmed 01, because it still has to have a game object to hold its damage collider. It just doesn't have a model. Remove the box collider. Let's add a sphere collider. Turn on gizmos so we can see it, and you can play with the size. I'm going to make the radius like 0.2 for now, but we can change that. And then just create a prefab, drag it in here, and then of course drag that prefab into the unarmed weapon prefab slot. And that should work as a normal weapon. Just everything should be fine now. Delete the prefab from the scene, and make sure you add the unarmed weapon to the unarmed weapon variable in the weapon, or sorry, the world item database. I'm going to make a prefab for the world item database as well. And yeah, everything looks good, so we can actually jump in and test this out. I'm going to save this now. I'm going to jump over to my straight sword animations. I'm going to get an equip animation here. Yeah, let's actually do a layer for that too before we move on. So let's go to the animator. And I want this to only play on my upper body so we can still run around while we're using this equip animation. So let's make a new layer up here. So you do this by hitting this little plus icon just like before, if you didn't know how. I'm sure a lot of you know how to make layers though. Going to make an upper body override layer, that's what I'm going to call it. And then I'm going to basically crank its value to something high like 1. So it's always playing. And then I'm going to create a new folder here in the animations under humanoid. I'm going to call this masks. Okay? Then under masks, I'm going to open this up and create a new, I believe it might be called avatar mask. I can't quite remember. So let's right click, create animation. Yeah, so it's called avatar mask right below animator overrider controller. And what you want to do is call this upper body. And then over here on humanoid, you just want to toggle the parts you want to animate. So for me, I'm only going to toggle the arms, the body, the head, and the hands. And if you want to, the hand IK as well. And that's it. Hit this little sprocket icon and go to where the mask is. Make sure the weight's at 1, by the way, and put in upper body. Now, make sure you have an empty state on it so you can transfer back to that with no animation. And then get your equip animation and make it transfer that empty state whenever it's done. And just drag it wherever. I'm going to name mine the same thing I named it in the code. I'm going to make the exit time something a bit longer so I'm playing at more of the animation. Just, play with the values as you see fit. Now, if I go into the game and go to my player, I'm going to go down here and I'm going to equip a weapon on my right hand because the left hand doesn't work right now. And I'm going to hit switch right weapon. And there you can see our straight sword comes out. Cool, let's switch it again and see if it goes away. So I'm going to tap that and I... Okay, so I forgot to disable the damage collider on the weapon. So let's do that. Whenever you make a weapon, make sure you tick this box so it's not enabled right away. Don't disable the game object, just the collider. Otherwise, you might hurt yourself or something else. So back into the code here too. After this for each loop, let's make a return if we do find a weapon. We don't want to run the rest of the code, so that's important. Call return there. And also up here, make sure you set can rotate and can move to true by adding true and true to the bools up here. True, 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 root motion, can rotate, and can move. Now let's go back to the function and let's delete this instantiate here because it doesn't need to be here. As I said before, just going to clean this up a bit, keep it tidy. You just need to reference the unarmed weapon and the instantiation happens in the other function. So let's save that. Now let's go back to the game and try this again. I'm going to put in my straight sword weapon model and my broadsword weapon model. So it should never go to unarmed. Straight sword, right? Broadsword, cool. Straight sword, no. What's happening? Wait a second. Okay, so click on the weapon model. Yeah, we're never removing the old weapon model, so it's switching. It's just instantiating a new model every single time. So right over here on switch right and load right and load left weapon, the first thing you want to do before running any code is reference the right hand slot and just unload it. And do the same thing for the left hand slot. Otherwise you'll have multiple models. So we say, what do I call that? Right hand slot dot unload weapon. And I'm just going to make a comment so that's clear too. So let's just say remove the old weapon. And then I'll make another comment below this, bring in the new weapon. Do the same thing on the load left weapon functionality here. So I'm going to say remove the old weapon and then bring in the new weapon. Say left hand slot dot unload weapon and bring in the new weapon. I'm also now realizing I just made a mistake in the order of operations. So let's go back to the function here and copy everything within this else statement and then delete the else statement and we're going to paste it right below here where we reset our weapons index just right here. And at the end, you just want to say return. Okay, now let's save that. Hello guys, Future Seb here. There was a small issue that is now corrected thanks to a Patreon for letting me know. At this statement here, at line 128, this should not be if it's less than 2. This should be if it's less or equal to 2 because we have 3 weapon slots. And jump into the game and test it. We're going to go through all the variants here. So let's go to our player model, and at first, I'm just going to equip a weapon on the 3rd weapon slot, just a straight sword or a broadsword. Now if I switch, yes, it goes to the straight sword. And I switch back, it's unarmed, working as intended. It only goes to the unarmed once and skips the other slot. Now, I'm going to equip another weapon. It should never go to unarmed. So sword 1 and sword 2. Yes, that is working as intended. Fantastic. Lastly, let's jump on multiplayer and make sure that when another player switches weapons, we can see it. So here we go. This is me on another client. I'm switching a weapon, and there it is. And I'm switching back to unarmed. There it is. If I equip another weapon in the inspector here and switch to these two, it should never go to unarmed. Yes, working as intended. So guys, thank you for joining me on this episode. We're getting close to the point now where we can start implementing our weapon actions system, or our item action system rather. So in that, basically, we're going to make the character perform an action depending on the item they are holding. That's coming up very soon. I'm also going to drop another additional video on top of that next one, probably at the same time, just going over and polishing some of the jumping movements in netcode. I want to give it its own video just for the sake of the title. I don't want to include it in something like weapons. So what I'll end up doing most likely is I'll publish another video, but then publish like a 2 or 3 minute video just revisiting a part of jumping and making it netcode friendly. Because there's sometimes in multiplayer where you want to sync the position, but there's other times where you want to let the position play out locally, and I'll explain more on why I say that in the future. It will make sense. Right now, don't worry about it as always. Just want to give you an idea where we're headed to. So on the agenda will be item-based actions. So then we can actually get some characters into the scene and have them fighting each other. As usual, if you made it this far, a like and a comment are greatly appreciated. It genuinely helps out the series so much. And I hope you all have a lovely weekend. I'll see you next week.